We have met the enemy, and the enemy is really tiny. Welcome to LunchBox Devotions. I'm Pastor Russ Yoke, and thanks for having lunch with me today. I say we have met the enemy, and the enemy is really tiny. And I think, of course, based on the optics we've got going on here, you probably assume that I'm talking about the coronavirus. I'm not. I'm talking about something that behaves, though, very much like a virus. Quick biology lesson. Viruses aren't traditionally alive like you and I are alive. They probably have a lot more in common with a mechanism than they do an organism. And by that I mean there are things that viruses do, but there are a lot of things viruses don't do. First of all, viruses don't replicate themselves. By that I mean viruses don't split up and become new viruses. They don't meet another virus, fall in love, go on a honeymoon, and 9 months later make a little baby virus. They don't replicate on their own. They rely on our cells to do that for them. They do not consume, and by that I mean viruses don't eat. A virus has exactly as much energy in itself when it's born as it ever will, and that's all it has. Viruses don't respirate, and by that I mean they don't breathe in and out in any way, shape, or form. No gas goes in, no gas comes out, and that's largely because within the virus itself, there is no energy generation happening. There is no metabolism, because of course they're not consuming anything. What does a virus do? A virus floats through the world either with some degree of motility that they're born with, maybe a tail. It's not really called a tail, but let's call it a tail for the sake of our argument here. Or mostly they just float along in whatever substance they're born in, which, of course, if we're talking about coronavirus, is bodily fluids. They float in whatever direction the stuff they're in goes in, and if they bump into a cell, the outside of them, if you will, in the case of what we call COVID-19, the corona of spikes around the outside of them, as you might imagine, the video I had at the beginning of this particular video is an artist rendition of what that would look like. They stick themselves into a cell, any kind of cell will do, they like our cells, and they will inject their, well, not even their DNA, it's actually just a half a strand of DNA, it's RNA, into that cell, which will then reprogram that cell to become a factory that does one thing and only one thing: make more viruses. And so then the cell will begin producing inside of itself more and more and more and more viruses. Eventually, that cell will produce so many viruses it can no longer hold them, and it will rupture open, and all of the viruses will spill out into the medium that it was growing in, and those viruses will then go on to do what viruses do, which is drift until they come in contact with something else. They have no minds, they have no thoughts, they have no motivations, they have no life that we understand life, but what they do is they drift until they attach to something, and then they inject themselves into that something and they replicate themselves. That's all they do. It's why antibiotics don't work on viruses. Antibiotics make bacteria, which are alive, and all of those different categories of respirating and consuming and reproducing. Antibiotics sort of short circuit that and kill them off. You can't kill a virus. It's actually not alive. It's basically just a blob of protein with spiky parts that injects itself into other cells. So why am I talking about this with you all if I said that we've met the enemy and the enemy is tiny, but the enemy is not a virus? Simply put, because the enemy behaves like a virus. The enemy is fear. I know we're all a little afraid these days, but fear produces all sorts of things. And the funny thing is when we project our fears out into the world, whether we're afraid of catching coronavirus, maybe we're afraid of the government, maybe we're afraid of white people, maybe we're afraid of black people, it really doesn't matter. Whatever fear that we project out into the world sort of drifts into the world as ideas, little teeny tiny things. Ideas aren't alive. They don't breathe, they don't self-replicate, they don't eat, they don't drink. They're just ideas. But boy, if they brush up against another human mind, they can inject themselves into that other human and replicate themselves, where that human will then repeat that fear over and over again. We see it on Facebook and Instagram and the internet just in general on a daily basis, but humans have done this sort of thing over fence tops and backyards for as long as there's been humans. My thoughts, my opinions, my fears and hopes and angers and all of the things that drift out of my mind in the form of ideas are viral. So are yours. You'd be amazed how powerful the ideas that come out of your head and out of your mouth are. We live in a world saturated in the ability to convey ideas like never before. Imagine the world has become, instead of a series of isolated locations, we've become one giant idea petri dish with nothing standing between one person's ability to infect others with their ideas and each other. We live in a very, very odd world that way. St. Paul understood this when he advised the church in Philippi, saying, "Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things." That comes at the end of the 4th chapter of Philippians, and it's easy to dismiss that as Paul just setting up his final goodbye, saying, "Hey guys, great talking to you. Keep your mind on good things, and I'll see you later." Like it's a throwaway phrase, but it isn't. It is a reminder that which we incubate in our minds eventually ruptures out into the world in the form of ideas. And if we fill our brains with, as Paul said, things that are good and wholesome and pure and beautiful and admirable, then that's what we're going to send out into the world that we live in. If our minds instead are filled with nothing but fear and anger and anxiety and all that this world seems to want us to fill our minds with these days, we are going to rupture out into the world ideas that are going to spread that contagion. And we don't think how powerful our words, our thoughts, and our behaviors are in influencing those around us. But ideas are viral. And if you are not cautious and careful about the words that you use, and the only way to do that is to only have your mind and heart and soul filled with things that are, as Paul says, pure and good, well, then you may be patient zero for a horrible virus of fear, anxiety, anger, and worry. So I say to you today, inoculate your brain with the gospel of Jesus Christ, the hope that it brings, the truth that it encourages us to embrace, and trust that God is in charge, is powerful, is truly caring about our best interest, and fill your hearts, your minds, and your souls with only that which is good. God bless you all. Thanks for having lunch with me. See you next week.